Okay, and we are on. I think that's the sound we're on. Okay, so here we are with the budget preview for this coming fiscal year for the 2022 and 2023. My name is Alex Nguyen. I'm the city manager, and with me is Betsy George, who is our chief financial officer, our CFO. The two of us will work together today to prevent this preview. So with that, I'm going to get started. I believe the screen is already in sharing mode, so let's see. Okay, great, it's working. So in terms of what and also where we are and where we're headed, we will also then Ms. George will go through, provide a very, very brief summary of municipal budgeting, and then get into the preliminary recommendations that we will be making to the city council for next year's budget. And then I'll come back at the end with some concluding thoughts. So in terms of where we were, I just want to remind folks that not very long ago, literally 3 years ago, we were facing a $9.2 million structural deficit. And we've worked through that, um, uh, including with standing a 2-year global pandemic that really did a number on the entire world. Here in Oxnard, it impacted us negatively as well. And then working through the second year of the pandemic, trying to climb out of this crater that we were in terms of the city's fiscal position. Thankfully, the voters provided enough confidence to give us Measure E, which helps us financially. And then as we're building and climbing our way back out, I stated to the city council and the community last year that we had about at least 3 years of restoration budgets in front of us. I still think that's true, but given today's circumstances, it may take a little bit longer. I'll talk about that later. But before I go on, I just want to say that there's no bad news here in our budget proposal. There are no bad choices to be made. It's all positive. So again, for a second year in a row, we are not facing any cuts of any kind. It's simply a question of what we can afford to add in this coming year. Next, a reminder of the City Council's established priorities. And here they are. This slide has been widely available over the last 1 or 2 years. And the main categories, of course, are quality of life, economic development, public safety, infrastructure, and natural resources, as well as organizational effectiveness. Again, this slide is readily available everywhere, including on the city's website. So I'm not going to go into those details at this time. Now, one of the most important things to discuss when approaching this budget is that we are looking out many years ahead and being fiscally responsible. And what I mean is we are planning the current budget with the 2029 budget in mind. And for those of you who follow City Hall information throughout the years, you probably already know that that is when Measure O sunsets. And we need to consider that now rather than come up to 2028 and face a financial cliff, which is essentially what it will be. But if we plan ahead now, that will not be such a devastating cliff. We can be prepared for that. So come the spring of 2029, when Measure O, the final payment of Measure O comes into the city, it's probably going to be at least a $20 million drop in the city's general fund budget. Could be more depending on what happens with the economy between now and then. So the most important thing and the most important message I want to get out there is that we need to, in making decisions on where we invest our dollars today, we need to keep 2029 in mind. Next is organizational effectiveness. And that really comes down to where and what and when and how fast and how much we can achieve in terms of the council's priorities for this community. And so here with revenue, the revenue, again, thanks to Measure E, it is now sufficient for our most basic needs to provide our most basic programs and services at adequate levels. But the revenue is what it is, and we hope for it to grow slightly over time. But again, external factors in the global economy have significant impact on that. But you can see here, depending on these choices and the policy choices that the city council makes, and that is based on the staff's recommendations, but the choices that the council ultimately makes in the budget determines, how much are we investing in staffing, how much are we investing in the other resources such as equipment, facilities, software, IT infrastructure, and that determines the amount or the speed and or the quality of the outcomes, be them services, programs, maintenance, and any areas of growth. So the top here shows you, if we are able to invest a lot in staffing and resources, then we can expect a lot more outcomes. And inversely, if we only invest a little bit, then the outcomes will be that much less. So there, and this is, of course, the classic balancing act that every city council faces every time they consider the next year's budget. So this is not unique to what we have to do in Oxnard. It is one of the primary duties and responsibilities of the city council, and one of the most difficult balancing acts they have to do for each budget. Now, I want to also point out the challenges in the year ahead, because there's a lot going on around us in the state, in the country, and around the world that will definitely impact us. So in addition to this pandemic that we're hopefully coming out of now. So we have, as a city, we are in labor contracts with all of our labor units right now. So we are in the midst of negotiating new labor contracts with all of our labor groups. So we don't know yet the outcomes of those. We're hoping to have them negotiated and presented to the city council in time for this budget. But it's hard, we've started early, but it's hard to determine exactly how long any particular labor group and the city will need to conclude labor negotiations. Next, of course, inflation. I think that's so much in the news, in the news that everyone's well aware of it, and B, as we as individuals and as companies and other businesses, and just including us at City Hall, as we go to purchase various items for everyday life, we notice the cost of all the goods and commodities have spiked this year. Supply chain disruption. This came as a major impact of the pandemic, but it is continuing and continues to disrupt our ability to, and not just the cities, but everyone's abilities to get the things that they need to do the work they do in the various sectors of the economy. Everyone's aware energy costs has gone up. So what's most obvious recently due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is at the fuel pump, but You've also noticed it in terms of electricity, um, uh, natural gas, other kinds of fuels. If the city also is a purchaser of those various sources of energy, so our cost for that is also increasing. Next is we still don't know if and when this pandemic will officially become endemic, phase out of pandemic and become endemic. We are seeing again lockdowns of entire cities on the other side of the world. So clearly, there are still variants moving around the planet. So it's an unknown right now. Next, of course, is the one of the other phenomena of the pandemic, the Great Resignation, and that is having an impact certainly around the country, uh, also in the news a lot, and greatly affecting us. It has been this year, and I am certain will continue to be in the year to come, if not even a little bit longer, a significant challenge for us. We are also having a hard time finding applicants for many of the positions that we have currently, and I expect that with any positions that we're restoring to the various departments in order to meet the city council's priorities and objectives and the outcomes for the community, we're having a hard time hiring. There's a certainly in addition to this great resignation, we have seen a migration of a lot of sectors of folks moving from regular full-time jobs and government jobs into the private sector where they can enjoy not only better pay, but also more flexible hours and the ability to work remotely. So we're having a hard time. I'll talk about that more in the next slide. Inventory of deferred maintenance continues, it's mounting. So the longer it takes us to catch up on deferred maintenance, um, over time, the worse it gets. But it is something that now that we have adequate resources, we are beginning to catch up on. And I think that, when you drive around the city, you're starting to notice in terms of what's the visible infrastructure of the city, the landscaping, the street paving, and so on. But there's also a lot of invisible deferred maintenance that we have to deal with. A lot of the stuff that's underground, our buildings, and so on. So there's still plenty to catch up on, but the um, the fact that we can't hire enough people is going to impact that. Again, the surprise of whatever this pandemic, whatever turn it takes next, is going to impact that, and the supply chain disruption will impact our work as well as what happens with inflation, if it continues, if it plateaus, or if it actually comes down anytime in the next year, also impacting the cost of the energy that we consume to run the city. Then, of course, lawsuits, just a part of our culture. I don't freak out about that. That's just how we settle differences in American society. It's actually not a bad thing at all. But as a city, again, like all cities, we will face um, lawsuits routinely. All right, moving on. I want to just use this as a very vivid example of how difficult it is for us to hire. So even with our part-time youth positions or city core positions, we have a lot of vacancies right now, and we're having a very difficult time hiring for this coming slate of summer programs that we normally do. So here is a great example of what we're competing with, even for those entry-level jobs. If you look at this, so McDonald's is offering above minimum wage pay. They are providing a 30% employee discount. Imagine that, especially if you're a young person, 30% off French fries every day that you work. That is extraordinary. Also appealing, of course, is flexible hours rather than a rigid a work week set of hours. And then this here, which is, I think, very interesting and frankly, I believe positive, up to $3,000 in tuition assistance. So even for entry-level jobs, we're going to have a hard time competing with the private sector. So those are my introductory remarks. I'm going to hand it over now to our CFO, Ms. Betsy George. Betsy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen. My name is Betsy George. I'm the Chief Financial Officer here at the City of Oxnard. And I'm going to provide a little bit of background on where we receive our revenues in order to meet the city's needs, and then talk a little bit more about our proposed budget for the next fiscal year. So on this slide, you have an example of the property taxes, which residents that own property within the city pay. And we get about 32% of our revenues from property taxes each year. However, on the property tax bills that residents pay, of the $5,000, the city is only receiving about $880 of that. And a large portion of it goes to the state and the county, funds education and other things. So when you see that property tax bill, know that that is not all necessarily coming directly to the city. And also, just as a side note, the amount that you're billed by the county is going to be a little bit higher than that 1%, because there are bond payments for some of the school districts and some other assessments that are on those property tax bills. But again, the city only receives that approximately $880 on each bill for a $500,000 representative valued house. So the next slide shows the breakout of that property tax. So the 1% Proposition 13 property tax that's charged, this is how it's broken out. So I mentioned before, a large portion of it goes to schools, it goes to the county, and Oxnard receives the 17.6% of that 1% property tax. And that is, like I said, it's about a third of our revenue each year, and so it is a big portion, and we continue to monitor that and project that as property values change throughout the city. Next slide. And another large portion of our revenue comes from sales taxes, and that's closer to 50%. It's about 46% of our revenue comes from sales tax. And that's a combination of the 1% base tax, which frequently gets called the Bradley-Burns, which was the name that it was given when it was implemented. And then we have the new Measure E of 1.5%. So that 2.5% of that portion goes into our general fund, which primarily we're presenting some of the general fund numbers later on. The Measure O tax, that 0.5%, goes into a separate fund, and the Measure O committee helps us make sure that we're spending that in accordance with the ballot measure that came at that time. So the total 9.25% sales tax that people pay when they do make a purchase within the city limits of Oxnard, 3% of that comes to the city, plus a very small portion of that Prop 172 public safety tax, but a larger portion of that goes to the county. So really, we're focusing on that 3% that comes to the city of Oxnard. Also to note, we have it circled here that in 2029, and Mr. Nguyen mentioned it earlier in his talking points, that the taxes are going to decrease for the residents. We'll be paying only 8.75%, but that's going to be a loss in revenue of about $20 million to the city in 2029 when Measure O sunsets. So we're working on forecasts that are several years out so we can make sure we can plan for that and what that might mean for initiative projects, priorities, and other services that we are able to provide. Next slide. An illustration of that sales tax. So on a $20 shirt, you'll pay $1.85 in sales tax. That's that 9.25%. And the city gets about 60 cents of that. And again, that's 3% of the total 9.25, or about a third of the tax that's paid by each resident on a purchase. So we've been collecting now our Measure E tax, which has been a great source of revenue for the city, and appreciate the support of the voters and the citizens in passing that ballot measure back in November 2020. And we, while the tax started being assessed in April of 2021, cash payments don't come to the city for a couple of months later. So we received our first influx of cash. We received a small amount back in June of 2021, with really our monthly allocations being at about $4.5 million each year that we're receiving. I'm sorry, each month, $4.5 million each month. And we've been receiving that since July of 2021. So in June, we'll have received a full 12 months of the Measure E sales tax. And currently for our 2022-23 budget year, we're estimating about $55 million in Measure E revenues. And so that is going to help us with these restoration budgets that we're working on. So last year we had presented a 3-year restoration plan. And so this budget that we're recommending now to council for the fiscal year 22-23 is year 2 of that 3-year restoration. So we're working on getting the improvements in and making good use of those Measure E funds. So a couple of budget highlights for this proposed budget that we're going to be bringing to the community and to the city council. So as we went out to the departments and asked for their priorities and what their needs were, we got back about $32 million in needs for next year's restorations and improvements. And based on our ability to afford those, we're at about 10 to 12 million for next year's needs is what we're able to add to the budget. And we need to make sure that we have funds for future projects. We have some large projects coming up, as well as Mr. Nguyen mentioned, making sure that we're able to be competitive in our staffing and consider inflation, et cetera. So the following slides are going to be the recommendations that we're going to be bringing to council to consider. So for the police department, last year we added just under $8 million to their previous year's budget. This year we're proposing adding around $925,000, so just under $1 million, and continuing on the focus of recruitment and hiring to address vacancies. We want to continue to invest in staffing to improve our service delivery for the 911 response times and that those calls that are received there. In the fire department, last year we added just under $6 million, and we hosted a new fire academy. This year we'll also be doing a fire academy, but we're adding just over $2 million, and again, continuing to invest in staffing to improve services to the community. We're going to be adding or improving our fleet. We have some very older vehicles, so we need a ladder truck and a couple of engines that we need to replace in order to continue our good service to the community. And then also we're going to be investing in some training. For public works, last year we added $2.3 million, and this year we're proposing to add $2.4 million. So we want to continue working on parks and medians, the landscaping, tree trimming, and this year we're going to be focusing on litter removal, groundskeeping, other maintenance services, and again, that maintaining the tree inventory and making sure that we're keeping everything healthy as we can, and continuing to work on, not listed here, but one of our priorities too is to make sure that things are drought tolerant and that we're being good stewards of the water that we, limited resource that we have. The next one is community development.
Betsy,
Yes.
I had a different number for Public Works. Let's go back and check the slide. So I had last year, it was just over 10 million. And this year it's, so last year was 10.273, this year it's 2.3. And I think you were looking at a different department because I think you said last year was 2 million and this year is 0.4.
Oh, okay, yes, I must have misspoke. Yes, this year
Right.
is last year was 10.3 million ads that we did really to get started on a lot of that work. And then this year it's 2.4 million. So yes, you're correct. Thank you for that.
Of course. Okay. So let's keep going. Here we go.
So community development, last year we were able to add into the budget as an investment in our community $3 million. And this year we're looking at just over $1.2 million. So we're continuing to invest in staffing to improve service delivery in the permitting and planning areas. The plan check services, we're going to be adding some scanning services to allow documents to be able to be reviewed electronically. And then not included in the $1.2 million is the investment in the new ERP system. So we're going to be implementing in the next 18 months or so a interface that will allow electronic plan check and other services to the community that will be able to be done online rather than so much in person and paper-based. So that should be a good it's a good investment and will really help our community and hopefully ensure better services. Cultural and community services. Last year we made a large investment, $3 million, really coming out of that, a lot of the COVID lockdowns, et cetera, and making sure that we were able to have those services for our seniors and youth. And then this year we're just continuing on that path to those investments in similar projects. The investment's much smaller. It's just under $200,000. And then the last department I'm going to highlight is technology, so IT, information technology. And that doesn't specifically come out of the general fund, but a large portion of it is allocated to the general fund because the technology department serves the entire city. Last year, we were increased about $3 million as we were continuing to migrate onto more up-to-date platforms. And this year we're proposing a $3.5 million increase to improve our staffing levels and service delivery, upgraded outdated equipment and software, as well as enhanced cybersecurity. So there's work to be done in that department, and we think that investment is going to be of good use. Here's an overview of the departments. And again, I mentioned before, these are preliminary numbers. They're going to be proposed to council. And so all of the general fund departments listed here, these are the totals that we're proposing. And I think on the next slide, we show these in a pie, a pie form, which is a little easier to see. And so you can see that for the revenue side, some of the numbers that I mentioned earlier, as we talked about the taxes and how the city generates revenue, with property taxes being about 1/3 of our revenues, and then sales tax just under 50%. And then we have other fees and services. And then the expenditures, we're projecting in the general fund $202,600,000 in general fund expenditures, and police and fire, so public safety, are a big portion of that, as well as public works. The non-departmental, I wanted to point that out specifically because it does looks like a large percentage, that 17%. And what's included in there is the $10 million IUF reimbursement that we need to make to the utility funds this next year, as we continue paying down that $36.5 million reimbursement. Also included there are the some bond payments. Our annual debt service is included in non-departmental, and then our capital improvement projects. So we have about just under $12 million in capital improvement projects, mostly streets and alleyways, that are included in non-departmental. So that's why that percentage is big. So those are Especially the capital improvement is really direct improvements for the city. And then here's an overview of all of our funds. So the general fund is about a third of the total expenditures for the city, but we're looking at just around $613 million in our preliminary budget for citywide. And this does include the non-city housing authority, but we wanted to show that because that is direct services that we're providing for this city. And then last, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Measure E and what we're calling the weaning schedule. And so as we've mentioned before, I'm sorry, I said Measure E, I meant Measure O. Measure O weaning schedule. And so Measure O is the half-cent sales tax, and it sunsets in 2029. It's about $20 million a year of sales tax revenue for the city. And so as we're planning ahead, we need to make decisions on how to bring those expenditures into the general fund in order to continue those. And so on April 27th, which is, April 28th, tomorrow, the day after we're making this recording, we're taking this to the Measure O committee for their feedback on our recommendations before we take it to City Council. And so the next slide shows what our proposal is for this first year. We have some ongoing Fire Station 8 operations that are currently paid out of Measure O funds, $4.7 million. And our proposal is for this year to move those into the general fund, and then in lieu of that, from Measure O, pay for some one-time projects, alleyway resurfacing, some IT upgrades, library Wi-Fi, and then paying down some bonds that we have that are currently serviced out of Measure O. So that's the proposed weaning schedule for year one of what will likely be a 7 or 8 year planning cycle to move those Measure O expenditures into the general fund as we're able. So that was all I had on the proposed budget. And so I'm going to send it back to our city manager.
Thank you, Betsy. All right, so just a few concluding remarks. So the key thing in terms of, again, how we on the executive staff are viewing this budget proposal, you remember earlier I said, we have to be fiscally responsible and work today with 2029 in mind when Measure O sunsets, so that we don't have whoever the city council is in 2029, or the city manager and whoever else is here when that time comes, so that they're not facing with a sudden $20+ million fiscal cliff. And then, so once you take that into account, then we just, it comes back down to what can we achieve with what we have, and that we need to be mindful of that. We need to be realistic about that. And given what's happening in the world today, we need to be realistic about how fast and how much. So as a reminder, the revenue here is what it is. And so what we choose to invest in staffing and resources also determines, again, the amounts, the speed, and the quality of the various outcomes. So that's, again, this balancing act that the city council, this exercise that they must go through to come out the other end and affirm and pass a budget. So one of the things I've been focused on is improving organizational effectiveness. And of course, a significant aspect of that is how much we can invest. But it also has to do with the long-term organizational culture that's been established here. Even though we do have routine turnover every year, attrition in terms of people retiring, people leaving for better opportunities elsewhere, there's always a standard attrition. But we still have a core cadre of employees that are here year after year. So it's now having new resources available. The organizational culture now has the opportunity to continue to improve, to be more efficient, to be more productive, and hopefully at some point soon, when we have enough folks here and enough to get more quality talent, to get at a place where we can also be more and more innovative. That is a goal. Again, as a reminder, there is a fiscal cliff coming in 2029. So we are every year between now and then, we are keeping that in mind. Again, a reminder about all the external challenges. All of these aspects here, how we settle our labor negotiations this year will impact what kind of investment is made into the workforce, what happens with inflation, what happens with the supply chain disruption in terms of the cost of the energy that the city as an entity must consume. If those costs remain high, that will impact what we can and can't do. What happens with the hopefully the tail end of this pandemic will also, determine what other disruptions we may or may not have in the year to come. How this Great Resignation rebalances itself will determine both the speed at which we can hire staff in our efforts to restore our programs and services, but also as significantly the quality of the applicants that we receive. And one of the things I'm determined not to do is hire in a panic and be saddled with mediocre employees going forward. So we still need to be as selective as we possibly can be in this this very interesting and disturbing labor market. So our inventory of deferred maintenance, we are playing catch up and we are getting to it as fast as we can. Again, we want to do a good job of that and not just do the quick and easy job. And of course, lawsuits are lawsuits. They will happen. So that finishes this presentation, this budget preview. Upcoming meetings, we're presenting this first and foremost at the INCO meeting on May 4th, and after that, we'll be at the city's Finance and Governance Committee. After that, the public hearing at City Council on June 7th, and then with various amounts of input at both of those meetings, all these meetings actually, and then ultimately coming to City Council on June 21st for hopefully an adoption. Now we will be pushing this video out as far and as wide and as frequently as we can in the hopes that many people will take the time to review this budget preview and provide feedback and input, questions and comments to the city council members as well as to city staff. So with that, thank you very much for making it through the end of this presentation. Thank you.